Thank you. Welcome back from the afternoon break, everyone. I hope that your physiology is going to enable you to stay awake for the next little while. I'm going to do my best to help. I'd like to, as many other speakers have, sincerely thank the organizers for inviting me. It really is an honor and a pleasure to participate. I think Eli hit it on the head earlier when he was talking about the difficulty of creating a presentation while looking at others' presentations and not knowing exactly what you were going to focus on, and I've had the same experience. Today I've tried to make a lot of notes about the talks that I've heard, not only in the session here, but in the previous sessions, and I'm going to do my best to pull this all together a little bit for some fun discussion. So I don't know if I'll be successful in any way, shape, or form, but I'll give it a shot anyway. So you can see my title here. What are the weird, non-intuitive trade-offs that we face in the Anthropocene? This title is motivated by the fact that the globe is now full, as Paul tells us all the time. And the other thing is that societies are now becoming closed in the sense that the feedbacks between our actions and the environment are tightening. So the key here is on trade-offs in feedbacks in the environment. So the other thing I wanted to call attention to is that economic analysis focuses on trade-offs. So we've heard a lot about trade-offs in all the talks today. There is no panacea. There are just challenging trade-offs that we have to navigate as we go forward here in the next several decades. In that vein, I'd like to put up some trade-offs that I've noticed. There's the famous guns and butter one that appears in so many old economic textbooks, so we know what that means. You can only do so much with your assets. The other one is intertemporal. Professor Dixit just talked about intertemporal trade-offs. How much do we invest now to avoid future costs? And we've seen those kinds of intertemporal trade-offs in many, many talks, if not all talks, implicitly. The next, risk rate of return. You hear a lot about that one. I've thought about it a lot. I know it exists. I don't know exactly how it works, but there are lots of ideas about how that one works. The next one is a little less common in most people's minds, performance robustness. So think of F-16 versus Cessna. Cessna is very robust. F-16 is not so robust, but much more high performance. The less familiar trade-offs that I'm going to try to organize our discussion around here is that of robustness-fragility trade-offs. And these trade-offs are really focused in the controls literature, and most of us don't think about these very often. What are some other weird trade-offs that we've heard about today? One that comes to mind is one that Scott Barrett mentioned, the fact that if we want to reduce Chinese emissions, that could actually heat up the planet because particulate matter in the atmosphere is cooling us down. So these are kind of non-intuitive trade-offs. And so I'm going to try to organize my discussion here around the idea of a control loop. So people in controls, electrical engineers, they developed most of the math that economists use in dynamic economics. Bellman equation, optimal control, Pontryagin, all that stuff. So there's a nice mapping between all of the discussion today and the basic tools from control. Not optimal control, mind you, but just control. So this is a basic control loop that many of you may have seen or none of you have seen, but it underlies everything we talk about. So here don't ask me why the engineers choose these particular letters for what they work with, but K is the controller. It's the decision maker. It's the investor. It's the government. It's the global government. It's the UN. It's something like that. And it makes allocation decisions about what assets to deploy. P is the plant. That makes a little more sense. A plant is the globe. A fishery, a car plant, this facility here. It's something that produces some valued streams of goods and services. Then there's some kind of output that you measure and then you feed it back. This is the trick here. And then you compare what you get out to what you want to achieve. So the temperature in this room, familiar thermostat. Then that feeds back into this loop. The controller makes another decision and the next loop occurs. So you can see that all dynamic economics, no matter how you frame it, is that thing, right? This is extraordinarily powerful, in fact, and I argue that all stable, interesting structures that we observe are based on networks of these things. For example, right now, there's a really cool feedback between some bones in your ear, some fluids, and some other dynamic processes in your brain and physiology that is keeping you from feeling sick and falling over. So you're a kind of an interesting, stable structure that's participating in this activity. The bad thing about feedback, you see my title here, Power and Danger of Feedback. is that no matter what, feedback loops exhibit a robustness-fragility trade-off. If you design it to do one thing well with noises and shocks, it will necessarily become fragile to other kinds of noises and shocks. So going forward, as we think about sustainability, maybe sustainability is about recognizing these fragilities. What I want to do is walk us around this loop for realistic or progressively more realistic cases. So many fisheries economists will recognize this one. You have a welfare goal, maximize the capitalized value of a fishery, for example. You have a social planner who optimally allocates assets. What does he or she allocate? Effort. Here's how much effort we can allocate in the fishery. How it's distributed, we don't know, but we're going to allocate some effort in the fishery. We're going to mobilize some human-made infrastructure, some boats, that's going to go interact with the fishery. Of course, this has been done for groundwater, forests, agricultural land, same sort of thing. And of course, out comes some catch, and then the catch is measured, or the state of the system is measured in some way, and fed back. Now, when there's no noise and we understand exactly how the system works, then this is all hunky-dory and we can operate really well. But these things here are disturbances. And we've heard a lot about these disturbances today. For example, there's a disturbance in our action. We want to do something, but then it's disturbed somehow. It doesn't turn out like we thought it was going to turn out. Next, you can get some disturbances in your outcome. Even though the dynamics of the fishery endogenously is producing some sort of new recruitment, there's a shock in some kind of weather event, some kind of upwelling event, or something that drastically changes the stock. And then, of course, there's a lot about this. You can't do anything unless you can measure. And there's always disturbances in measurements. So we think of ourselves on the globe as the plant, and we're all decision makers. We're trying to keep the thing running. And without these disturbances, it's not very hard. With the disturbances, though, our electrical engineering colleagues have developed all kinds of really cool tools to make sure that the plane that you came here on didn't crash, right? So there are really powerful tools to enable us to still design real-world controllers to achieve reasonably what we hope to achieve given these kinds of shocks. Eli mentioned this earlier in the sense that optimal control really is useful to set your goal. What are you kind of shooting for? And then the practical implementation part of that, that's the real challenge. Okay, so let me walk us through a more real-world one. Here's what we face. Actually, the controller thing is a decentralized decision-making process involving diverse actors and multiple social dilemmas. What does this introduce? Time delays. We all know that feedback loops with time delays are inherently unstable. Big problem number one. There are multiple social dilemmas that we heard several speakers talk about today. Next, of course, then once we take these actions, they can be disturbed. But then those feed into this complex, poorly understood network of public and private infrastructure. Right? So there's hard infrastructure out there. There are dams, there are levees, there are docks, there are cities, there are ports, there are oceans, there are forests. So these networks of public and private infrastructure fit together very, very complex ways. I was very fascinated by the impact of roads and forests. Perfect example, right? Roads are hard human-made infrastructure, forests, natural infrastructure. They interact in ways that are really difficult to work with here. Then you have multiple flows. Then you have imperfect measurement and censoring. Here, it's much more difficult to try to take these robustness fragility trade-offs into account. Much more difficult. So I'm going to walk you through how it becomes more and more difficult to do what the control engineer would like to do in our real system, and hopefully stimulate some discussion that way. Next, Steve Carpenter and colleagues did a nice piece recently where they translated this kind of idea into a nicer framework that enables us to think about it more clearly, this safe operating space framework. So your goal here is to stay within this annulus of staying within the planetary boundaries and outside the inner social boundary. So the inner social boundary includes things like, equality, gender equity, all the things that we want for welfare. The outer boundary is the planetary boundary. This translates beautifully for engineers. They love to keep whatever system that they're working on inside of some target, right? Like an airplane in the air, keep it in the target. This is a nice way to think about this. This is your goal. You can imagine that's feeding into this mess, feeding into this very difficult to understand process with very imperfect measurements. Now, I'm being optimistic here. I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I'm just saying this is a really, really challenging problem. And worse yet, as Steve and colleagues explore in their recent paper on this in PNAS, that these decisions actually impact the way this thing functions. Now, no engineer I know would want to work on such a system. Because if the way you're driving the system starts to impact the way it behaves, that's a real challenge. And the only kind of equivalent thing I can think of is, for example, hypersonic flight vehicles, where as you approach hypersonic velocities, the body of the vehicle starts to change. So then the flight controls don't work the same way. Very difficult problem. That's kind of what we're in here in terms of the challenges we face with decision making. So the idea here is that, as Steve and colleagues shows, that if you manage for variance here, for example, if you adopt policies to reduce variance in welfare, for example, that can change the underlying structure of the system and reduce your safe operating space, which reduces your capacity to cope with other kinds of shocks in the system. Just one more slide here. I could show you how this works in a real system that I worked on, a fisheries system, and how these robustness fragility trade-offs work. I won't go into detail. Just notice the colors are flipped there. That's all I want you to see. And if you reduce sensitivity with respect to, say, a biological parameter, you increase sensitivity with respect to an economic parameter. So it's difficult to balance biophysical and economic parameters. They're fundamental trade-offs. Not a guns and butter trade-off, though. A very different one. One where you're becoming robust, coping with problems and shocks, but necessarily becoming fragile to other kinds of shocks. So, what I wanted to focus on here in this slide is, if we're going to have any hope of struggling here to run this thing, if we're going to have any hope of understanding or making this thing work well, it seems to me that that's where we should focus here. This is difficult, right? But if we can't get this thing working reasonably well, the other part of the system is going to struggle as well. So recently, Hoff and Stiglitz did a really nice piece trying to expand classes of behavior that we think about. And you see they've divided into three columns here of different kinds of deviations away from our assumptions about how people make decisions. So we've heard a lot today about how different actors make decisions in different situations, right? So they divided it into three categories where really, here's where we need to be thinking about. Over here in this behavioral economics strand 2, where there's a focus on what the authors called enculturated actors, in the sense of people's behavior is very context dependent, extremely difficult to predict, and when we start thinking about policy in this difficult feedback loop, we need to consider these things. So I just had a couple of thoughts to throw out there for discussion here as we think about we are in a giant feedback loop. These giant feedback loops are magical. They produce all of the interesting structures that we see around us, yet they're extremely fragile. And whether or not we can navigate these fragilities, maybe that's the sustainability question. How do we navigate the inherent fragilities that emerge as we try to drive the system for our particular needs? And I just throw up some things to think about, and I'm not even sure I'll say them. I'll just throw them up there as things to read about, and we can open it up for questions or move on to the next speaker. I don't know how you want to proceed.
Great. Why don't we